If it's, hey, mimic the style of Phil Collins or Van Gogh, you can imagine some kind of lookup database where it figures out how to send royalties to that estate or that artist and go, okay, the user explicitly asked me to copy your style. Here's a few bucks. That feels relatively straightforward. But when it's general creativity and you're putting entire classes of intellectual capital out of business, there's no way of copyright lawing your way out of that.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Emil.
And I'm Chris.
And I'm Yaniv.
And on today's show, we're going to discuss Carta and Lineo's privacy dispute. Is Carta violating their duty of care to its customers? And how do you balance the needs of monetizing your business and adapting to customer expectations? New York Times is suing OpenAI for copyright violation. What is the future of creativity and copyright law in the age of generative AI? And the imminent approval of Bitcoin spot ETFs. How will this affect the price of Bitcoin and the future of cryptocurrency generally? All right, let's jump right into it.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Coda. If you want a platform that empowers your startup to strategize, plan, and track goals effectively, you can get started with Coda today for free and get a $1,000 credit at coda.io/TSP. That's coda.io/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get started for free and get a $1,000 credit. coda.io/TSP. This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. You might know that sinking feeling. You're about to land a big contract when they ask about compliance. SOC 2, ISO, PCI, Essential 8. You've just snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Not anymore. Vanta massively accelerates your compliance efforts and allows you to get those life-changing deals back on track. Don't wait until it's panic stations, though. Get started with Vanta today. They're offering 20% off their prices just for TSP listeners. Do yourself a favor. Hit pause, go to vanta.com/TSP, that's VANTA.com, to get that 20% off. So the first thing we have on our run sheet, guys, is to talk about Carta, and there's been a bit of a shit show happening the last few days.
Yeah, so people know that Carta, whose last valuation was $8 billion, is a SaaS company. What they sell to startups is cap table management, shareholder management, investor management software. So you don't have to push paper around. You can exercise your stock grants and all that stuff online. And then they have a subsidiary called Carta X that allows trading in the stock of private tech companies. The accusation that one of their customers made was that they were using the cap table information on one side of the business to drive sales on another side of the business. But it's blown up into privacy, company, honesty, PR thing.
So let's unpack this a little bit because I'm coming at it cold. What precisely are they being accused of doing on the two sides of the house? So like, how does having the cap table advantage the product that allows you to trade the secondaries? What are they allegedly doing there? And then what was the CEO interaction? What did he say in response to that?
So basically what they were doing is they have this other company that is providing a secondary market. And so Lineo is a hot company. There are investors who are like, I want to buy into this thing. And Carta was reaching out to existing shareholders, and they could only do this because they had the contact details of all of the existing investors because they happen to be providing cap table management services. So I think there's two things here, right? Like Emil said, first of all, it's just a breach of privacy. You have to know sometimes where, you've got two business models, right? One is the customer is the customer, right? I pay Carta to manage my cap table for me. The other business model is the data is my product and the customer is simply the supplier of the data, right? Which is like what Google or Facebook or whatever do. But Carta is trying to have it both ways, right? Like they had a service where highly confidential information was being stored. And then they're like, oh, let's see if we can monetize that information. It's like, no, this is not your information. So that's basically what happened.
Right, I gotcha. So they've got all the investor details. The whole cap table is in their system as a management software, managing the cap table.
Exactly.
And over on the other side, they're trying to create a secondaries market where they're selling stocks on the private market through the Carta liquidity platform. And they're trying to get more supply of this stock, right? So they're reaching out to the private equity holders who they know because of the cap table product. And they're going, hey, you've got equity in this company. We know, we can see it. Would you like to sell us some, or would you like to make it available on our marketplace because there's demand for it? And of course, that was not the intent of signing up and using Carta in the first place. So that's a interesting breach of trust, I guess. And then what made it worse is that the CEO of Linear noticed this and tweeted about it and kind of made a fuss about it. And the CEO of Carta dealt with it in suboptimal ways. Response to, I guess, was a bit, let's call it aggressive, not taking it
Well, it
back.
was confusing. First of
Yeah.
all, he was like, no, it was some random rogue thing, not a
Mhm.
program, like word salad of explanation. And then went aggressive on him for like making a big deal about it. And we still kind of don't know, like, is this a policy that they've broken? Is this rogue actors, a one-time incident? Is this like part of their business model? Because they're saying, oh, we messed up. Well, if you messed up, then it's not an intended business model. So no one really knows what's going on, but the CEO is getting roasted for being tone deaf on it.
Yeah, it's just like bad crisis management, bad PR, and it's sort of like you wonder why this happened. So it basically, what he was doing is he was taking the founder of Linear to task for posting publicly about this on Twitter rather than going privately to him and saying, hey, here's this problem. I'm like, no, you guys fucked up. You get to be called out, even if it's not a systemic problem, you get to be called out on this publicly. You have no right to then publicly again, because then this became a Twitter shitfight, to go after him and say, hey, how dare you expose the fact that we screwed up publicly? That's not very nice. It's like, you know what? Boeing had that 737 MAX, the window blew out, and that was in the news. Like, it didn't go to Alaska Airlines and say, hey, why didn't you just tell us it's just one plane had its window blow out? Like, why make a big fuss about it? It's like, no, this is bad. A bad thing happened. The world has a right to know. And I think it's just terrible crisis PR. You always apologize. You always take full maximum responsibility for what happened. You never try to deflect. You never try to blame your victims for what happened. And the fact that, yeah, the CEO of an $8 billion company doesn't get this or doesn't have the self-control to do that is just insane.
Yeah, and it seemed to me from the tweets and the emails that the Linear CEO shared, he's trying to make 2 points, the Carter CEO is. One is, hey, you should have spoken to me privately, founder to founder, CEO to CEO about this. Why are you making such a big deal? And the second was, hey, this was just like a rogue email. It was a nothing thing. And why are you blowing it out of proportion? So those were his two primary defenses. The first one is maybe there's some kind of professional courtesy if they're both young companies, they know each other or something. He might, on a personal level, be asking for that, but that's not something you get to demand. It's not a way of managing a crisis of PR when it's somebody you don't know, demanding that they should have dealt with it differently. So that's, on the face of it, a weird thing. But the real question, or I guess the related question is this a policy of theirs? And what is the ethical line of taking a data set you have over here for a paid SaaS product and trying to migrate some of that capability over into a marketplace and into a data business? What is the right and ethical way of doing that as well?
Right. On the first one, had it been me and I stayed in an Airbnb, it was a crappy experience back in the day. I would have called Brian before I blasted him on Twitter just because we're running the same circles. But again, he wouldn't have had the right to demand that I do it that way. As you say, on the second question, there's some threading to do here. Like I could imagine Carta Liquidity just saying, hey, we're going to collect all these lists of people who are interested in the stock. And then I'm going to go to CEO of the company and say, hey, just so you know, here's how much demand I've gotten from the outside. Are you interested in seeing it? And the CEO could say no, and it can't be based upon the information on the cap table. That's potentially some way to make a marketplace that takes advantage of what would exist on their software customer base. But if they're really just saying, hey, Chris, I saw your angel investment in Revolut. I have this buyer who wants to buy it. That's whoa. That's like definitely not what people bought into.
Well, let's unpack this a little bit because I'm always conscious that sometimes the first person's perspective you hear, you kind of default to their perspective and go, oh, yeah, that's shocking, right? But the first question is a secondary market for private equity okay? And does the company need to bless that? Or is that something that should just be okay? And then the second question is, what is an elegant way of letting the shareholders know that there is demand for that equity without violating privacy, right? Like, so let's deal with the first one first. Should companies need to be able to opt into secondary programs? Or is that something that just happens whether they like it or not?
Actually, let's take a step back, and Emil, I'd love your insight on this broader question, which is why might a founder care about a secondary sale happening on their cap table?
So founders could care for a lot of reasons, who's on their cap table and what price a secondary transaction's done and so on. And the reasons are several, but I'll list a few of them. If you have more than 500 shareholders or some 1,500, I think, you may have to register with the SEC. if there's a lot of trading in your stock, it affects your 409A valuation, which affects your stock option price you give to your employees. There is potentially a morale impact on your employees if they see trades happening at a certain price. And that's why most companies don't allow the free selling of their stock. They require board permission or company permission. The ones that don't, yeah, they shouldn't have a problem of trades because they've sort of allowed that to happen, right? Uber is a public company. They can't stop me from trading it. But most companies have restrictions and permissions and processes to have control of what happens on their cap table.
And so these secondary markets that have sprung up, are they often doing it, I guess, in a way that is against the company's stated preference and they're just doing it anyway? Or do these things tend to be blessed by the company?
In my experience, they're mostly gray area and they're doing structures around the stock to not actually move whose name's on the cap table. They're doing things like what's called a forward contract. Like, I promise to sell you this stock at a later date when the company goes public at this price today. So they're trying to work around it. We at Uber, like over time, like we tried to capture every workaround to stop this. But sometimes they are going to companies. These are third parties who have no data about the company. And they're saying, hey, would you bless a sale to so-and-so? And sometimes a company founder might.
It feels like the mistake then that Carta made was creating a secondary market for equity in the first place, or one that did not involve the company itself opting into that explicitly, right? Because if you're building a SaaS product for companies to manage their cap tables, your primary persona, your primary stakeholder is the company. You need to keep them on side. You do not want to also create a gray zone secondary marketplace for that equity that the companies that are your main customers did not opt into, right? So step one would be like, hey, opt in to secondary trading of your stock, which would then turn on and grant permission for Carta to provide some kind of demand signal to the shareholders and provide them to opt in and to provide them to list their equity on this trading platform, right? So it feels like spinning up this business at all and not making it opt in for their customers feels like a mistake.
I think the lessons here are interesting. One is about why founders care about who's on the cap table. Two is around crisis communication. And three is about the dangers of monetizing data that doesn't belong to you just because you have access to it.
What I want to be careful about is like, it's so easy to be like, yeah, that they're wrong, but like wrong about what? It's so easy to say you shouldn't have done that.
They're using data that doesn't belong to them. That's what they're wrong about. We don't actually need to know the details.
Right. I say, Yaniv, let's suppose I emailed you, email on Gmail, my company cap table.
Mhm.
And the Google algo knows that Chris is on your cap table and someone buys the keyword or AdWord, I want to buy stock in this company. Hey, Google says, well, so-and-so has stock in this company. How do you feel about that? I mean, that's what Google does, right?
Yes, I feel there's a difference. I'm trying to put my finger on it.
Well, let me talk about a more direct example, right? So I interact with Facebook, I like stuff and interact with stuff, and then Facebook sells my data, rather mediates my relationship with advertisers to say, hey, wouldn't you like to buy this shaving cream because you have been looking up shaving equipment, right? And
Absolutely.
so if Carta has access to data saying you own something that someone else wants to buy, why is presenting that? Maybe not in an email, but maybe in some kind of like notification tray or whatever. It's like, hey, as a user of Carta, you'd like to know that there's demand for the equity that you hold. Unless secondary markets are something companies don't want and Linear did not opt into, then the problem is not that they emailed their users. The problem is that they spun up this entire company in the first place because it's a conflict of interest with their core business of hosting this data.
Yeah, I would say that it is a conflict of interest. And that's the thing where the Silicon Valley startups, there's a danger here, right? Which is they saw a giant pot of money. And again, these are still in the realm of accusations, whether this is systematic or whatever. But like just in terms of the liquidity product, right? It's like, okay, there's good money in cap table management, but you know where the real money is in investment banking. Like it's in being a trading platform or a market. It's impossible to resist that pot of money. And I think it's easy to get into trouble.
Yeah, the main point I'm trying to say is like, this is not, I think calling this a privacy problem is missing the upstream mistake, which is that it's creating a secondary business that is at conflict with the goals of your primary customers in your first business. And so everything you do in that secondary business of selling secondary shares is in conflict with the goals of your customer. Not just emailing the shareholders, it's selling their stock in a gray market secondary marketplace is the conflict. And
Well,
so,
okay. Well, hold on. No one said that they've actually completed a transaction without the permissions needed. They haven't been marketing. We don't know if they've like done this gray market thing. But I will say, look, investment banks, like you said, they advise companies on mergers and acquisitions, and then they have a trading side of the house that trades stocks based on public information. So there are companies who have internal conflicts. They build Chinese walls as ways to do things. Look at it the other way. AngelList now allows a VC fund to raise money from LPs and it manages all that. I mean, you can imagine AngelList offering cap table management to companies and then saying, hey, by the way, we have this set of LPs. Would you like them to potentially invest in your company? And then the next thing would be like, oh, would you also permit them to trade in your company's stock? I mean, there's a business there and one reinforces the other. And as long as there's permission. So I think it comes down to, is this a violation of their user agreement or not? And if it's not, then it may feel creepy, but it's not. If it is a violation of their user agreement, that's more problematic.
even if it's not a violation of the letter of their user agreement, it is a violation of the spirit of the tool.
The spirit, sure.
I think that's the thing. This is about business models, right? I think people, at least somewhat, have an understanding of what they're signing up for. And if I am paying for B2B SaaS, I'm expecting my data to sit in there and be mine. In the same way that, if I'm using a spreadsheet, I'm like, whatever data I put in that spreadsheet, that's my data. That's not your data to monetize. You're monetizing my usage of the product, not anything else. And then, you've got something like Google or Facebook. It's understood when you search that you're not paying for it and you're paying for it by allowing your data to be monetized. And I just think they got themselves in a tangle and they've pissed off their customers. Like, yeah, I agree. It's not about privacy. It's about they've pissed off their customers. They've done something their customers are not happy about.
All right, well, let's first head over to the New York Times, which is sort of related to this Carter thing, right? It's about permission and the social contract and what one expects when they interact with the world. We've all heard this for the last year or so since ChatGPT, that these large language models are trained on data from the internet, data that's been created by creators, authors and artists and what have you, for one context, for one purpose. It's a New York Times reporter writing an article for their audience. It's an artist putting something on DeviantArt or Dribble for their own fans or for sale. And massive companies like OpenAI are scraping and learning on this data and producing generated content, in some cases that looks very much like an artist's unique style. You can explicitly say, give me something in the style of Van Gogh, or give me something in the style of Malcolm Gladwell, and it will literally create content in their image. And in some cases, producing stuff that looks very much like the original training data. And of course, rightly so, a lot of creators and companies, journalism companies, artists, and so on, are really concerned about this. And the New York Times has filed a copyright claim against OpenAI and Microsoft, I believe. What do we think about this, guys? What do we think about this idea that training on content is a violation of copyright, and also simulating the style of an artist or an author is something that's a threat to their livelihood? And where does all of this go?
Well, let me answer the first question, and then maybe Yaniv takes a shot at the second. If they're surfing publicly available websites that anyone could go read, Wikipedia takes stuff from the internet, and some of it's synthesized, some of it's cited. It feels hard to say it's not a fair use of publicly available information. How you render it, I think, is a separate question. But using it as training data feels like a fair use of what's out there in the world.
I'd say it's uncharted territory. We currently have an intellectual property regime, copyright and whatnot, that is very 20th century. It actually hasn't been fit for purpose for quite some time, ever since the internet came into play. I think it's just even less fit for purpose. And I think the interesting thing about intellectual property is, all property is a social construct in a sense, but intellectual property even more so, right? Because the difference between intellectual property and physical property is that you can copy it for free, right? So if you have a goat and I take your goat, you no longer have a goat. But if you've written something and then I take the thing that you've written, we both have a copy. And so going all the way back to the Napster wars and all that stuff over copyright, it's tricky, right? Intellectual property laws exist to balance the needs of creators who have put in effort to create something new in the world and the needs of consumers of that content. And so there's no sort of natural copyright, I guess is my point. With LLMs, I don't think it's a question of, is this legal? Is this not legal? Is this fair? Is this not fair? I think it's nearly about going back to first principles and thinking, okay, if we're trying to maximize some type of social good, what is the deal? What is the law or the regulation that needs to exist to say there is still an incentive for me to create new content in the world? And when that content is used by somebody else for their gain that I benefit from that in some way. And in this case, is it a copyright violation? I don't know. And you can say, well, hey, if I, a human being, reads the New York Times and then I go to a dinner party and I'm more erudite because I've read the New York Times, that is not a copyright violation. That is not an intellectual property violation. But this is where, like, it's not a difference in degree, it's a difference in scope. The LLM can read every single thing ever and has perfect recall in some sense. It suddenly changes the equation because it only exists and it can only do certain things because it has consumed this content, and then it can generate new content at scale. I don't have the answers, but I think these are the questions. I think it's not a slam dunk where it's like OpenAI did nothing wrong and, New York Times should just shut up and suck it up.
Yeah, I think often these reactions are so polarized where there are people who are, techno optimists, is like they've done nothing wrong and they should be allowed to do it. And then there's the creators who are like, this is a complete violation of my creative and intellectual property rights. And yeah, it's just too hard for people to take an extremist position on. It's worth knowing a few different things. Firstly, the content itself is not stored in these models, right? They don't even know, the people who are building these models, how knowledge is being stored and replicated from the model. There's like this bizarre thing going on where there aren't documents and images in the model, and yet the model is able to repeat knowledge and generate insights. And it's something that's a bit of a crazy mystery to us right now. But the content is not like in a Google index where the actual documents are sitting. That's important to know. The other is about this fair use doctrine for copyright talks about, I don't know the technical term for it, but the question of, is it materially different? And I think in a lot of cases, a lot of what LLMs are creating is materially different and a new synthesis, and it's not just regurgitating what has been written before. But in some cases it is. In some cases it's eerily the same or similar to an article or a piece of content that's been created before, and that is more of a problem. I think this question is just so much broader. The question is not just how does this impact creators? It's how does AI and generative AI specifically impact all forms of labor and cognition and intelligence and creativity. It's not just the artists who are going to be potentially impacted or put out of a job here. It's all information and knowledge work.
Let me give an example that I think is actually real. Let's say you said, ChatGPT, draw me a property contract because I'm selling my house from this person to that person. And what it does is not search LegalZoom or Paul Weiss's things. It goes to every publicly available court document ever filed that's got all these property agreements attached to it. And that's the government. They don't maintain a copyright on that, right? Anyone could go and like literally copy a contract. No one's ever said that that's copyrightable. You put all the lawyers out of business. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there are a lot of weird cases here that it's going to take a lot to grapple with them.
It's just such a big problem, and creativity and style and what have you is just such a small sliver of this. And I think almost the easiest part to address, because if it's news like the New York Times, you can imagine ChatGPT citing sources and linking off to the news. If it's, hey, mimic the style of Phil Collins or Van Gogh, you can imagine some kind of lookup database where it figures out how to send royalties to that estate or that artist and go, okay, the user explicitly asked me to copy your style, here's a few bucks. And that feels relatively straightforward. But when it's general creativity, whether it's art creativity or news writing creativity or legal creativity or code writing creativity, and you're putting entire classes of intellectual capital out of business, there's no way of copyright lawing your way out of that. That is just a change in the way the economy works. And I'm not sure if there's any kind of law that'll fix that.
I think you're right. Well, I mean, the interesting thing is, like, Luddites have been around for hundreds of years. They're named after like a 17th century British guy. And every time a new technology comes along and puts a class of labor out of commission because it replaces it, there's this sort of sky is falling thing where it's like automation's bad and now we're going to have mass unemployment and people will become pointless. And every time we've found new uses for people's labor. Now, the interesting thing is, it's always tempting to say this time is different, but one day it will be different. And the question is today that day, right? Where it's like, okay, we've now created a machine that is superior to humans in nearly every aspect of intellectual work. And frankly, the history of human economic development has gone from physical labor through to knowledge work. If we eliminate most knowledge work, what's next? Yeah, I don't know. Like, it could be fine, or it could be society altering in weird ways. And I'm not sure yet.
It might be different this time, and we've talked about this a few times on the podcast, right? And the idea that this is perhaps a rate of change that is so rapid that it disrupts our ability to absorb it, to absorb the change, right?
I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic that people will find stuff to do with their time. Not that it won't be disruptive, but I'm less worried about that. I am worried about in the near term, how you actually have some fairness applied. Forget like I'm worried about masses of people not working. You're like, what is the answer on the New York Times? Or with some blogger or a musician or a lawyer? Is it citation? Is it how you render it? Is it, hey, X% of this answer to your question about the Israeli-Hamas war came from the New York Times? What are the kind of practical things? Because God, I'm afraid of politicians worrying about the end state and destroying sort of everything before it even gets going. I'm more like, how do you practically do this stuff? Because music has a rights system and a royalty system. It's complicated. It's a pain in the ass, residuals. So there are systems that have been built to make sure that technology doesn't destroy industries. Are there guardrails you could put on this in a real way that everyone's happy with and makes sense?
Yeah, but I mean, I haven't heard anybody give an optimistic view of this that convinces me, where it's like, oh yeah, I could see how people might migrate to this other different kind of work. When you build a more and more perfect machine that can model or exceed the human capability, well, you are by definition replacing the need for whatever a human can do. And the more perfect the machine becomes at mimicking or exceeding humans, the more likely it is that we become relatively irrelevant to the economy. In fact, I've heard the opposite, where I've heard very clever people. I was listening to Neil deGrasse Tyson talk about this, who is usually a very thoughtful person, very clever, very creative, who just seemed to be completely obtuse, completely oblivious to the risks. He's like, well, it's just a box sitting in a room, right? It's not going to be able to do anything humans do. And it's just like, what are you talking about? He's like, they're not going to put it in a robot body. And it's like, I'm
Like
sorry.
the
Are you
hell they
paying
aren't.
any attention at all? It's just like nobody's thinking fourth dimensionally. It seems like nobody's watched a sci-fi movie. But it is worth saying that OpenAI, Apple, they are now talking about paying media companies for their content, and they're cutting deals to do that. And I think that's particularly relevant and necessary for certain classes of content. But I think it's kind of putting your finger in the dam, honestly.
Well, no, it might not be. And, what I
Yeah,
was
I
going to say
mean,
before, Emil, like you're talking about fairness. And my point about intellectual property laws is they were never about fairness. They were about a structure that encouraged the types of activity that as a society, we decided we wanted to encourage. So we wanted artists to be able to make money so we'd get more art. And if you actually think about OpenAI, all these players, they need training data. If they make it such that creation is no longer a viable economic activity, they're going to run out of training data. So there is actually a symbiosis here, and it's probably in their interests. Again, it's not about fairness. It is in their interests economically to provide nearly this type of patronage back to the creators of their source data.
Maybe they need training data. Maybe they need it until the AIs start creating creative content that is net new, right? I'm talking about new science and new math and new physics and new news articles. Why do I need training data? I mean, Tesla is training on simulated data, on synthetic data. And there is now large language models being trained on open AI data, like being trained on ChatGPT. And so they're bootstrapping their own models using other LLMs. So I'm not sure how much longer they're going to need us, the lowly humans, with our little bit of content.
yeah, I don't think they're going to run out of trading data. I mean, let's do the counterfactual. They said, okay, New York Times, we're not going to train your stuff anymore. And to the extent we can, we're going to untrain our model on you. For a ChatGPT user, I probably don't give a shit because it's going to suck in other things that are similar enough that I'm going to get what I want anyway. And so could they form a union and take like every news article and paywall it in terms of service? And, maybe, but someone's going to say, well, I'll do it for a small price. So I do think the media companies are just on their backs on this one because I do think they have the leverage.
The obvious analogy is actually with Google, right? The Google News indexing thing. But I'm sort of interested in teasing out the differences potentially. So with Google, we had this interesting situation where the news sites felt that they had lost control of their distribution and that Google was benefiting from having their content in their website. But Google was like, hey, we have this thing, robots.txt, and you can at any point simply opt out and, your content will no longer be indexed by Google. And the news sites are like, oh, but we actually do derive a benefit from being on Google's index. It does take our traffic. And so they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. Google provided benefits. The question is, The difference to me potentially is there a benefit to a media organization from providing training data to LLMs? And if not, if an opt-out mechanism were created, if the equivalent of robots.txt were created for media organizations for LLMs, would they all pull out? Because there's no actual benefit to them. There's no traffic going back to them from being part of the training set.
We should be very careful here, right? Because there's a distinction between training data and let's call it reference data or knowledge. I think actually OpenAI's GPTs calls it knowledge. So you can train the model to develop meaning and the ability to speak and respond. You can train it on non-New York Times data and users will not know the difference. And then there's this separate thing, which is at runtime, asking the question, what happened this week or today with the Israel-Hamas war, and being able to cite the New York Times and then link to them. And I think, the New York Times opting out of the first thing, training, I think will make no difference to OpenAI, as you said, Emil, unless they do it en masse and they kind of remove all their content. But the second thing, just like Google, I don't think New York Times wants to be removed from ChatGPT any more than they want to be removed from Google. They want to be cited in any question about the news, and I think it would be silly for them to try to opt out of that. It's like a search result, and you want to be included in that index.
Right, which goes back to the difference between how this is rendered to the ChatGPT user. Can the New York Times get credit, distribution, attribution? And how do you do it? It's really hard. In the example in the lawsuit, it looked like a verbatim article, like 90% of the words were the same. So that's why they put that in the lawsuit, because it's a clear example. You're like, I mean, this is crazy, right? These are the same words without any New York Times attribution to it. But maybe there is something there about attribution, traffic, and so on, like there ended up being with Google.
Yeah, and this distinction I'm drawing may be the key to it, right? Which is like training data is training data, whatever.
Yeah.
But should ChatGPT be able to spit out an entire New York Times article and provide none of the ads and none of the traffic and none of the whatever? That's where, like Google, they might provide certain constraints and say like, hey, you can summarize it, you can provide the key facts, but then we want you to display a little card and a link off to the New York Times with a citation. And that does feel more like there's now I need a feed from the New York Times and I need to have display guidelines and constraints about that.
Yeah, or ChatGPT just has a satellite in the sky and does news by itself.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. The team at Vanta are passionate about helping you secure your business by vastly cutting down on the time to get compliant with frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and Essential 8. Vanta lets you close deals, sleep better at night, and get back to building your product. Help yourself and help the podcast by going to vanta.com/TSP for an exclusive 20% off deal.
Okay, so then let's quickly touch on our third item today around the crypto ETFs, imminent decision on that from the SEC and the related, maybe closely related, rise in crypto prices over the last, I don't know, let's call it 6 months. As I sit here today, it's just hit 47,000 US dollars per Bitcoin. So it's been going on a fairly healthy run. By way of context, very quickly, there's a couple of tailwinds for Bitcoin right now. Interest rates are pausing. There are signals that that's coming back down. So market is rotating to risk on a little bit. And there is signals from the SEC that they are now more seriously considering the Bitcoin spot ETFs from a number of firms. And they're asking, hard questions and operational questions. It looks like they're about to give it a go ahead any moment now. In fact, they may have even done that by the time this episode drops. And so there's a big run up in Bitcoin prices in anticipation of this. They're buying the rumor and maybe even selling the news. So guys, what do we think about, just very quickly, Bitcoin in general? Is this just a continue of the pump and dump? What do we think about these Bitcoin ETFs? And where does Bitcoin specifically and crypto generally go over the next 24, 48 months?
I actually wrote some predictions at the end of last year about 2024. And what I basically said is I'm bullish on Bitcoin and the rest of crypto is still pointless, more or less. Right. And so I think what's happened with Bitcoin, this is not a particularly original view, but I think it's sort of one that I now subscribe to, is that Bitcoin is now a legitimate asset class as a kind of the digital gold concept. The idea that Bitcoin is a scarce resource that we have collectively as humanity deemed has value, that is now baked in. I do believe Bitcoin has value. And so I think something like an ETF, which simply provides more access and more liquidity into that asset class, should increase its value. And, Bitcoin is somewhat unique in that it's an asset class whose scarcity is mathematically baked in. So, okay, Bitcoin is not digital currency. It's not any of that stuff, but it's digital gold. I buy that and it will be there for the foreseeable future, I believe. That doesn't mean anything about the utility of the whole sort of crypto, DeFi, Web3, etc., blah, blah, blah stuff. Someone pointed out on Twitter the other day that crypto is now half as old as the World Wide Web And so this idea of like, oh, just give it more time for like real applications to emerge, it's like, at a certain point, it does not appear to me that we're on a trajectory where blockchain is revolutionizing much of anything. I could be wrong. There's not 100% certainty, but I think, it's one of those things where the burden of proof is on the side of folks who think that crypto is a world-changing technology at this point to actually prove it. Until then, it's like, well, you've had a lot of cracks, a lot of attempts. They haven't really gone anywhere. I don't think a Bitcoin rally actually means anything positive for crypto more broadly.
But yeah, okay. So Bitcoin is digital gold, and just like gold trades, and it has like this anti-inflationary element, the safety element that's cross-border. If someone invented the next Bitcoin that had similar features, like it was limited in quantity, why wouldn't that work?
So here's the thing. All currencies and these types of assets that are like non-utile assets, they have value because we have collectively, it's a collective delusion. They have value because we've all agreed they have value. Forking Bitcoin is trivial. Like all you need is a different, seed or whatever it's called, and you get a whole new chain. So it's not about the technology. It's about Bitcoin has been around for long enough and has had enough capital flow into it for a long enough period that I believe that collective delusion is now baked in globally. And when I say collective delusion, I don't mean that in a negative way. It is just Bitcoin is valuable because Bitcoin is valuable. If someone comes up with like Bitcoin, like in fact, Dogecoin, I believe, is just a Bitcoin fork. It has no actual new technology in it. It's not as valuable because it's not Bitcoin.
There's not a lot of delusionary things, right? Currencies are backed by armies.
Mm-hmm.
Gold has some delusional element to it. Silver is actually traded, my understanding is, just because of its utility. So this would be like one of the few, mass delusion on sort of acceptable traded value assets, right?
Yeah, I think really only gold. And yeah, gold has utility, but it trades well in excess of its utility.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on how far you want to go down the rabbit hole, but like, it's all just narratives, right?
It's all just protons, neutrons, electrons, guys. Like, why the fuck are we doing this?
Yeah, exactly. My long held belief on this whole space is that blockchain is a fundamentally new and important technology that is here to stay. That to me feels like 100%. It's a new way of doing this kind of trustless distributed verification of work and immutability. And that's awesome. Bitcoin as kind of the first application on the blockchain is interesting. And as you said, Yaniv, I think it has value because we've all decided it has value. And I think Bitcoin is 99% here to stay. It is well and truly enmeshed itself in society. And I think that is a fairly safe bet at this point. I think it's been a safe bet for a while. I will say, though, you mentioned that it's not a currency, it's gold. I think, like a lot of technologies, it's actually a hybrid. It's two things at once. So, Facebook, is it a media company or is it a platform?
It's a shit currency. It is an absolutely shit currency, Chris.
It doesn't matter if it's good or bad at the use case. The point is Facebook a media company or a platform? The answer is yes. It's a hybrid of both.
Yes, but
And
Bitcoin is
Bitcoin a
clearly not a
currency or
currency. Bitcoin is clearly not a currency.
I think the laws that have been passed to make it act more like an asset, where when you sell it, you have a capital gains on it, has mitigated its usefulness as a currency. But I think if you take that away and you take away the price fluctuations, which by the way, it has fluctuated less than the stock market, it's actually been quite stable.
Yeah, and shares are not a currency either. Currency is a currency.
No, what I'm saying is that Bitcoin, like a lot of technologies, don't neatly fit into historic buckets. And if you take away the capital gains aspect of spending a Bitcoin or a Satoshi, then I think there's very little reason why it can't be used as a currency or something on the blockchain like a Litecoin or a whatever that's lighter and faster. I think it can be used as a currency, except for the laws and infrastructure that's spun up around it. But the point is only that it's here to stay, it is valuable, and as you said, has a mathematically built in limit, which very few things actually have scarcity. And then I do think, though, there are other applications of blockchain that are interesting. They haven't been proven to be valuable yet. But like, for example, Ethereum as a generalized Turing-complete computing platform to build yet more applications on the blockchain is an interesting thing. What are those applications and will they be useful ultimately? I don't know. But I think Ethereum is fundamentally different than Bitcoin and useful in its own right. As it relates to spot ETFs, yeah, more accessibility, more good. And it should drive the price up. And, it'd be interesting to see what happens. Everyone's buying the rumor right now. I'm curious if, because of all the liquidity that comes in, does the price go up or do they sell the news and then, it goes down? I'm actually not sure what will happen. Does anyone have any predictions on what will happen after the announcement actually comes through?
I mean, if you read Anthony Pompliano sort of tweets about Bitcoin a lot. He has this stat that he publishes every now and again that says like 80% of Bitcoin has not changed hands in the last year. So it's like this small amount that trades And therefore, if you have these funds that have to buy it to satisfy demand, the supply of Bitcoin hasn't changed, the trading supply, and that would indicate that the price would go up because you just have this demand. It's sort of like when Uber was added to S&P 500, it just went up because like ETF funds had to hold Uber now. Like, sorry. So that's what it feels like here.
That's my intuition as well, but I've seen people on MSNBC and what have you say, like, oh, the price of the ETFs is baked in, it's priced in. But my sense of it is like, I don't think it works that way. I think there's a limited supply and people need to buy this thing to fulfill the needs of the ETF. And so I'm actually very excited to see what happens. Hey, it goes up, goes down, whatever. I've been a buyer and holder for a long time, and I'm not selling anytime soon. So we'll see what happens.
Okay, you're a rich man then.
Well, depends on how many. I will say, just for a little bit of fun, I'll tell my story about Bitcoin. I bought 10 Bitcoin at $400 while I was living in San Francisco. And I think it spiked up to $1,500 a coin. And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm a freaking genius. I caught this thing at the right time. It's going to be awesome.
Sold.
And then a bunch of bad news came out about how Bitcoin won't scale. It's all over. And the price started cratering and it hit $400 and I sold. And it cratered down to like 200, 100. And I was thinking like, I'm a fucking genius. I sold out of this bullshit before I lost my shirt. It's great. And then spiked up to whatever, $2,000, $3,000. And so I proved to be an idiot both ways. But I eventually accumulated back in, so it's been fun. All right, guys, it's been a pleasure as always. Yaniv, Emil, we will catch up in the next one. Don't forget, guys, if you've been listening to a few episodes of the Startup Podcast, you've implicitly signed the Startup Podcast Pact, which says, please share us on your favorite social network, follow us and review us on your favorite podcasting app. We love to see your feedback, and it helps us grow the show and reach more founders and help more founders like you.
All right. It's been fun. Thanks, guys.
Great to see ya.
See you later, guys. Bye-bye.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Coda. I met Shishir, the founder of Coda, in its early days, and he told me they were reinventing documents from the ground up. They have absolutely done that, folks. Coda brings together the best of documents, spreadsheets, and apps into a single platform that really reimagines the document. One thing we wanted to emphasize today is the way that Coda can help your startup with planning, with strategy, with tracking goals. If you think about how hard it is to stay aligned around documents, roadmaps, OKRs, planning cycles, Coda is the perfect place to bring all this together. It has integrations, automations, all sorts of powerful tools and templates that allow your team to stay on the same page. And if you listen to this podcast, you know how absolutely critical that is. Coda really is a fantastic platform, and exclusively for listeners of the Startup Podcast, Coda have a special offer where you can get $1,000 of free credit if you sign up today. Support the podcast and your own startup by going to coda.io/TSP for the Startup Podcast and get started for free and get a $1,000 credit. Coda.io/TSP. This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta helps businesses get and stay compliant by automating up to 90% of the work for the most in-demand compliance frameworks. With over 200 integrations, you can easily monitor and secure the tools your business relies on. Head to vanta.com/TSP for 20% off their incredible offering and start unlocking extra revenue today.